Before we go on to the next section, I might mention chiasm. Has anyone seen chiasm before? So in our contemporary literature, when you write a story, you usually have the major development near the end of the story. When you tell a joke, the major development's near the end of a joke. In ancient writing 2,000 years ago, the major point was often in the middle of the book or the piece of writing. And you'll find this even in a chapter. So if you have a whole chapter of ideas, often in the middle of the chapter is the key point. And one of the students mentioned Jonah. So if Jonah's got the whole book, I would expect that the key point will be in the middle of the book somewhere. And often the ancient people love to repeat what they did getting to the middle of the book and going back out from the middle of the book. And so often there's a mirror image in the second half of the presentation that matches what is presented in the first half. And so in Mark's Gospel in the New Testament, the first 10 chapters build up to a point. Everything's going well. Jesus is doing great things. He's the Messiah. Great things are going to happen. And then right at that midpoint, halfway through, Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" And of course they say, "Oh, you're the great triumphant Messiah. Everything's going to go well." And Jesus says, "I'm going to go to the cross. I'm going to suffer. And it's through suffering and the cross that we go forward." And then the second half is reflecting the great things in the first half, but moving towards the conclusion of the suffering. So you've got two halves that reflect one another. And we'll see this more next week in poetry parallelisms. The ancient people like to state something and then repeat it in the second line. So there's a parallelism. And so we see in a lot of ancient writing, there's a parallelism. The first half builds to the key point, and then the second half builds away from the key point. So chiasm describes that moving to a middle point and then moving away from the middle point. So make a note of that term, look a bit further at it, and again, knowing a theoretical concept gives you a lot that you can explore. You can Google it, go to the CHC Library online website, look up the topic chiasm in literature and in biblical literature, and that you can explore that. One of the things that we were talking about in the previous session is how you can have different viewpoints and how dialogue can express different viewpoints. And we're going to come to Mikhail Bakhtin, and down the bottom of the screen there, you should be able to see the name Mikhail Bakhtin, a Russian philosopher. He speaks a lot about different viewpoints in dialogue. Now, we've read Genesis chapter 1, God makes the world all good, da 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 da. We've read Genesis chapter 2, 3, 4. The world's got a lot of badness in it. Da 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 da. There's Beethoven there. And how can you have these contradictions? I mean, you and I need to edit God's work for us. If you want to do that, we have a cult going afterwards. But God's given us these contradictions. And in education, in higher education, we've said this challenges you to think, to work it through, and to own the new decision yourself as to what you think. And that's what scholars say the biblical editors and authors are doing here. They're challenging you to think. So Mikhail Bakhtin says, in dialogue, you have huge opportunity to think. Using two-dimensional thinking, if I was to ask you to choose between a circle or a rectangle, if you looked at the shape I've made here, hands up those who would see a circle, right? And then if I was asked another group of people to look side on at the object that I'm holding up here, how many people see a rectangle? Hands up. How many people see a circle? And we've got a disagreement here. We've got confusion. We need to get rid of one of the groups and just keep the other group. But Bakhtin would say it's when you have dialogue discussing the difference that something much more creative originates. And so instead of having a rectangle, a cylinder side on, or instead of having a cylinder end on, or a cylinder side on, Bakhtin says a higher way of thinking, yeah. Oh, they're not even seeing what I'm saying. So admit. All my wisdom has been wasted. So welcome, Jade Keller, Matthew. So welcome back. We're saying that I'm back. If you were to look at a cylinder side on, you'd say it's a rectangle. If you look at a cylinder end on, you say it's a circle. But in actual fact, a dialogue will show that different perspectives more fully describe what is going on. And the Russian philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin said that dialogue is essential for human life to understand different viewpoints and to mature and grow through an understanding of these different viewpoints. Juliana Klassen's 2003 Biblical Theology as Dialogue says that Mikhail Bakhtin proposes translations of language are largely made up of dialogues, and there are different viewpoints and different personalities in these dialogues as they come from people of different backgrounds and different approaches and different expressions. And so Bakhtin says a plurality of independent and unmerged voices and consciousness, a polyphony, is going to help us find out what is real. Bakhtin says life by its very nature is dialogic. To live means to participate in dialogue, to ask questions. And then, as the student said before the break, this encourages us to admit humbly we don't know everything. Dialogue encourages us that there's other viewpoints out there. We need to be listening and open and humble as we are open to the other viewpoints that are out there. So I've begun in this first session today talking about the importance of dialogue because I've suggested that this theoretical concept relating to dialogue and many concepts relating to dialogue could be profitably carried through in your analysis of dialogue in the biblical literature. And in other assignments that you do, I encourage you that if you have some strong theoretical concepts from strong thinkers and scholars, that'll strengthen your assignments and strengthen what you are doing. So Bakhtin's ideas on dialogue as a discussion between people, I think, very valuable. And many scholars have therefore used Bakhtin in the study of biblical literature. Bakhtin argues that very often different forms of language and ways of understanding the world exist within a single cohesive text. For Bakhtin, authentic human life is open-ended dialogue that will grow every year of our life for the whole of our life. And Bakhtin declares that each word and utterance is dialogical in its nature. That is, we say a word, welcome students, but that's open-ended. The students will respond or not respond. For all those online, unfortunately, we have a few sleeping here, but I'll go and prod them. And so Bakhtin says that language sets off a change of events. Interestingly, Bakhtin says when Moses and the Exodus are written down, it doesn't just exist in that time, but when they go into captivity 1,000 years later, they're going to use that and add to it. When Jesus leads the people in 2,000 years ago, that's going to add to it. Bakhtin says literature is never just what's originally written. It has a life of its own. It catches new ideas. It develops further, says
Excuse me, Sam.
Yeah.
Could I please interrupt? It's just, I think it might be Jade has left her mic on. Oh,
yes, I've just hit it. There we go. Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate that.
Thanks.
So sometimes we need dialogue, like Matthew's, to open up the possibility of difficulties that are happening through the airways. And sometimes we need mute to remove some dialogue. And when our wives say, am I looking beautiful? Or our partners, we need mute to preserve rather than the dialogue. So dialogue's important. Bakhtin declares that words and text cannot be heard or read in isolation from one another. So what are the words that go before that? What are the words that come afterwards? And so in Australian history, anyone who speaks in politics, they're speaking after 200 years of history. And anyone who speaks are speaking before another 100 or 200 years that are going to unfold in the future. Every one of our dialogues is in the midst and in a chain of events before and after us history, and hope in the future. So Bakhtin maintains that words and utterances are in the flow of time, and he uses heteroglossia to describe the ways in which the presence of two or more voices and approaches and viewpoints in a text. So when we read in the biblical text, we should expect to find heterogeneous viewpoints, heteroglossia, different viewpoints. And so he uses the term diaglossia to also acknowledge that there's a dialogue going on. And he uses the term polyphony to describe the many voices that may be present. And one of the challenges for us is to discover truth in the midst of all of these presentations. So Bakhtin describes the potential for creating new meaning in terms of notions in great time. And so if you're looking at a book, I would encourage you, whatever assignments you do some good biblical studies, go back to the original time in which your assignment was set and write down what is the time. So we've got someone doing the Joseph narrative. I would encourage, go back and think, this is back around about 400 years before Moses, 1800 BC. And so some conservatives would say the Joseph narrative comes from the setting 1800 BC in Egypt. So you write a few sentences on that, and scholars that hold that view. And then you think, well, really, it might have been written later at the time of Moses or later at the time of King David when there's a lot more writers. And so you go to scholars who say that 900 BC could be the time when it was edited and put in written form. And so you'd write that down as a scholar holds that view. And then some people, very liberal scholars who want to be free of everything, they would say it could have been written at 400 BC. So you quote a couple of liberal scholars, and this shows that you're aware of the great range of viewpoints. And then you don't want to get bogged down unless this is your specialty that you want to do more work on. So you state that, you put scholarly references to show you're aware of that. But then you realise it could mean something to Christians, or it could mean something through our history over the last 1,000 or 100 years or so, and then it can mean something today. But I encourage you, probably in this subject, you don't want to give more than a third of your assignment to just what it means today, which is contemporary reading. That's very interesting too. What does Joseph mean for people today? So that's one possibility. Whatever subject you're doing, I encourage, look at the original likely context and background and date, then look at other times through biblical history, and then look at other times through history. Narrow it down to the last 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years or something like that. That's irony. And then you can also look at contemporary readings, which are also very interesting. Denominations might read it differently as well, and so that's very interesting as well. And when I did my PhD, I did a bit of wrestling with what did history mean back, revivals back, biblical times, through history, what did it mean in the last 100 years, and then what's it been psychologically, sociologically. So you look at these different perspectives and scholarly ways of viewing things. Bakhtin says, all writing then takes on a life of its own. And so in Exodus, we looked at a little while back, people in South America read it as a liberation document that leads to a liberation theology that present people in Korea see Exodus as speaking to them as a liberation document. And so each biblical writing can have its own liberation there. So I'll put these notes up on Moodle, and if you have trouble finding them, send me an email, and then I can email you the notes for each week as well. Just as an example, if you look at the story in Samuel 19, Jonathan talking about his father, David's a good person, just accept him. That's how it begins. But 1 Samuel 23, there's a bit of a battle between Saul and David, and some of the people are going to lose their lives over it as well. And so you realise Jonathan's viewpoint changes through the narrative. And so rather than a flat characterisation that describes a person in one way holding one view, what scholars have said is that the views of Jonathan change, the attitude of Jonathan changes. And so I'll put an example of an article that discusses this here as the voice changes as the narrative goes through. So Brian Brock, also in Teaching of Christian Ethics, says that often we could go to Socratic dialogue as a way of understanding the power of dialogue. And so Brian Brock, Prayer and Teaching in Christian Ethics, Socratic dialogue with God, says that there's strength in Socratic dialogue because it helps people consider a range of different viewpoints and therefore teaching's effective, not just giving simple answers to people, but encouraging discussion, working through of the different points there. And so I encourage you, dialogue with one another and look at the dialogue there as we go through. So let's just run through. We'll go to the online people in a minute, but just ask people in class, starting back row, can I get you in pairs to talk with one another? So you two talking with one another, you two talking with another, you two talking with one another. What are the benefits of dialogue is what we're discussing. And then moving on to putting it into literature, I guess, how do you show different viewpoints in literature, I guess, would be the second question. So what are the benefits of dialogue? And then how would you show it in literature, even the Bible? Thank you. Start with day to day and then move on to literature. Yeah. And so I'll ask online too, if you can speak to me, Jade first and then Kayla and then Matthew. What are the benefits of dialogue day to day in showing this in literature? And then we'd, and in the Bible. So we'll ask Jade first. So Jade, your thoughts, what are the benefits of dialogue day to day? And then we'll move on to in literature. Jade. And while waiting for Jade, we might move to Matthew. Matthew, what are the benefits of dialogue?
Dr. Hay, Jade just said in the chat she can't speak. It might be because you muted her previously. You might have to be the one to unmute her.
Yeah, now I've asked to unmute. So I'll click on ask to unmute. Do you want to try it again, Jay, and see if you can unmute? Yeah, not happening so much. Thanks, Kayla. Kayla, do you want to tell us what do you think is the benefits of dialogue?
Sure. In the day-to-day, I said it helps us grow as people. So I know you made a comment earlier about thinking thoughts we've never thought before. But I think also in dialogue, those thoughts are assisted in formation through engagement with others. So when you hear what someone says, you are considering it, you're adopting it, adapting it, or rejecting it from your own thinking. But it helps to, I guess, propel and support the considerations that lead to your thinking and then perhaps thoughts you never thought before.
And I love those terms, adopting, adapting, rejecting. So does that come from an educational type idea, theory?
No, they were just the 3 words that came to mind.
Well, they're good 3 words. I like it. And thinking thoughts never thought, and then adopting, adapting, rejecting. And I guess there's a weighing up, isn't there? And so you're weighing up those thoughts, and then you're thinking, what's the consequences? What's the benefits? But I think the real strength of what you say is thoughts you've never thought before. That's what brings growth. Yeah. Matthew, what are your thoughts?
How dialogue helps with perspective, forming your own understanding about things, getting different perspectives on the same thing, gives you a greater understanding of the idea or concept or object. And yeah, it's good practice as teachers as well to encourage that.
And that, of course, means that in a business meeting, if you've got a group of 5, it could be better than 3 because you've got 5 perspectives. And there's probably an ideal size. And I guess the ideal size is probably somewhere around about 7 to 12. Any more than that, you may not have room for the different viewpoints that are held. And then you could sort of have breakout groups for that as well. Yeah, that's great. All right. And then Jade, are we back with a voice or Jade's still got electronic laryngitis, I think. Yeah. It's not opening up. I've forced it closed. So after the break, it should come back, Jade. So my big apologies there. Let's go to the whole group now then, and then we'll ask the group what are some of the benefits of dialogue as we draw this point together. So brief statement, one person from each group. So let's get a brief statement, one person from each group in the class. So at the front, benefits of dialogue. And of course, in a well-rounded way, you probably got to show them reacting slightly differently to different people as well, and to situations, and working things through in the dialogue as well. Those taglines, as we said before, if you put a tagline and say, this person is nervous, and then you'd remove that later, but you'd then use that in what you say. Yeah, love it. Thoughts, dialogue, benefits?
Tagline said like it some way to reflect personhood, and in these persons where we don't exist as an individual, we're not just one mass collective of people involved, but there's this balance of actually talking and dialogue between us, so we understand ourselves and others through dialogue with others. And then Lustra is like reflecting reality. There is a continual showing how things change and adapt and that, and really trying to give a broader view of the world, understand how what's happening it is.
And you've got to decide which views are relevant and most true, and so you'll run with those. And then, of course, there could be all sorts of different cultural views. You can't squeeze them all in, but I think you're right. It does reflect the fuller view of the world. And two of the terms that are sometimes used, one is autonomy. And so a fully functioning person should think for themselves, but there's a danger in individualism and autonomy. The other view then balancing this is heteronomy, where you think as a group and you listen to the other members in the group. The danger with heteronomy is that that can lead to group think. So if the group makes a decision, like Germany in 1939, let's go to war with the rest of Europe, then if everyone follows that group think, then there's a lot of danger can flow out of that. So you find that one person might stand up at a time like that and say, this is wrong. And so we do need some individualism and autonomy at times, but we also need some group decision making as well. And so I think many people would say we need that balance between the autonomous thinking individual and the group as well, that's feeding information to the individual. And that's part of the challenge of life. And so the dialogue in literature could reflect those tensions there. You could work with that. And this group. Yeah, and when you mentioned in that first one, the benefit for mental health, people I think certainly value affirmation, but it has to be correct affirmation. So if they're entirely wrong all the time, then that's probably, you know, when you've got a 97-year-old still driving their car, but constantly bumping things, I can drive, sure, you can still drive. That's irony again. Then you have to be careful. But people, I think, do want a certain amount of affirmation. I don't know how you go with dialogues that are always quite argumentative. And occasionally you have TV shows that go that way. They start off very nicely and then they become more argumentative. So let's take our break there. And you've got time to have a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back at about 2:15 to 20 past. So I'll see you shortly.